Some stories begin with an event so ordinary, so unremarkable, that no one could possibly predict the enormity that follows. The disappearance of the Ellison family began with something as simple as a family photograph. It was the autumn of 1891, a calm, gray season in Nottingham. The fog rolled low across the cobblestone streets, softening the gaslight and dulling the sound of carriage wheels. The city moved at its usual pace, predictable, polite, and utterly unaware that one of its families was about to step out of existence. The Ellisons lived on Hawthorne Lane, a modest street lined with tidy brick houses and iron railings polished every Sunday. By every measure, they were a respectable middle-class family. Edward Ellison, 46, was the owner of a small but prosperous textile business, known for his punctuality and precision. His wife, Marianne, 41, was gentle and meticulous, often described as the kind of woman who could keep the world in order if given a broom and a prayer. Their 3 children, Thomas, 17, Lydia, 14, and little Samuel, 10, were equally unremarkable in the best of ways. Thomas studied accounting at the local grammar school. Lydia played the piano at church. Samuel had an obsession with pocket watches and was often found dismantling them in hopes of understanding how time itself ticked. Neighbors remembered them as the embodiment of Victorian virtue. The family attended St. Luke's every Sunday without fail. Their home was neat, their voices polite, and their disputes, if any existed, never reached the street. Even their mail arrived on time. It was on a Monday morning, October 12, 1891, that Edward decided the family should have their portrait taken. Marian later told a neighbor, "It's good to preserve what's dear before winter comes." The statement, so casually spoken, would later take on an uncanny resonance. They booked an appointment at Horace Blythe's studio, a respected establishment near the Nottingham Market Square. Blythe was known for his disciplined technique, glass plate exposures, precise lighting, and his insistence that no portrait should merely resemble a family, but contain them. At precisely 10 o'clock, the Ellisons stepped into the studio. Witnesses from nearby shops would later recall the moment. The father in a dark frock coat, the mother in a high-collared dress trimmed with pearl buttons, the children immaculately dressed and strangely composed. They seemed calm, too calm, some said. The session lasted less than an hour. No unusual sounds, no interruptions, just the faint smell of chemicals, the slow hiss of the gas lamp, and the click of Blythe's mechanical shutter sealing one moment in time. When it was over, the family thanked the photographer, stepped into the street, and vanished into history. 3 days later, a delivery boy brought a message from Blythe's studio, informing Edward that the photograph was ready for collection. The note was returned, marked undeliverable. When Blythe himself visited Hawthorne Lane, he found the Ellison residence empty. Not merely unoccupied, but emptied, as if life had been vacuumed out of it. The furniture was gone, the curtains stripped, the pantry bare. Even the coal scuttle by the hearth was missing. More unsettling still was the absence of any sign of departure. The neighbors swore they hadn't seen wagons or porters, nor heard the clatter of furniture being moved. No one had witnessed the family leaving their home. Within days, local authorities conducted a search. No records of travel existed. The railway station logs bore no mention of the Ellisons. Their bank accounts, active only a week earlier, had gone dormant. The parish office discovered that their names, once neatly inked into attendance books, had been erased, replaced with blank spaces, as though the parchment itself had decided to forget them. Even the family's likenesses were missing from social gatherings. Paintings and photographs that once displayed the Ellisons' faces in neighbors' parlors were inexplicably altered. Faded outlines, blurred figures, or, according to one startled witness, completely blank spaces where faces had once been. But one image remained untouched, the portrait that started it all. The photograph that Horace Blythe had taken that Monday morning. And in that single glass plate, history seemed to have left a trace of something that should not exist. A family caught not only in light, but in a moment where time itself appeared to have folded inward. The photograph became the only surviving proof that the Ellisons had ever lived. Every other document, record, and recollection seemed to wither in its shadow. And it was said that when the plate was held to the light, The figures did not merely appear, they watched back. That is where the investigation begins. With one photograph, one family, and a mystery that has endured for over a century. How can a single image erase the people it was meant to preserve? Before a disappearance becomes a mystery, it is first a routine. And the Ellison family were creatures of perfect routine. In late Victorian England, society was structured around predictability. Every hour accounted for, every relationship governed by quiet, rigid order. The Ellisons fit this model precisely, almost unervingly so. They were, by all accounts, the sort of family no one ever noticed until the moment they were gone. Edward Ellison had built his small textile company from nothing. A man of calm discipline, he kept meticulous ledgers. Rows of inked numbers so perfectly aligned that clerks often joked his handwriting could be used to set a ruler straight. He was not a dreamer, nor a philosopher, but a man who believed in the sanctity of systems. His business dealt in imported cotton threads, supplying local seamstresses and clothing shops across Nottingham. The books showed modest profit, stable growth, and nothing remotely suspicious. Marianne, his wife, managed the home with equal precision. She was the quiet pulse of the household, methodical, graceful, and beloved by the parish. Every Wednesday afternoon, she visited the sick with parcels of bread and coal. Every Friday evening, she wrote letters to her sister in Derbyshire, always ending with the same line, "We are well and all continues as it should." Their eldest son, Thomas, had inherited his father's practicality. A student of arithmetic, he dreamed of working in a London bank. Lydia, the middle child, showed early artistic leanings, sketching faces on the margins of hymnals, a gentle defiance of the rigid decorum expected of Victorian girls. Samuel, the youngest, was the dreamer of the family, endlessly curious, particularly about timepieces. He dismantled watches and clocks with uncanny skill, as though trying to understand what lay behind the ticking. Neighbors on Hawthorne Lane remembered the Ellisons fondly. Mrs. Langford, who lived next door, would later tell investigators, "They were the most normal people I ever knew. So normal, it's as if they were drawn from the pages of a conduct manual." Indeed, there was no scandal, no financial trouble, no hint of illness. Their tax records were immaculate, their social reputation spotless. The 1891 census confirmed their presence in the house. 6 rooms, 3 servants, and a small garden at the rear where Marianne grew lavender and lilies. The family's photograph album, later recovered in part from a distant relative, showed picnics by the Trent River, birthdays, Christmas dinners, and one rare image of Edward smiling. There was nothing to suggest what would come. But beneath their stability lay small peculiarities that only became significant in retrospect. Neighbors recalled strange flickering lights through the Ellisons' windows at odd hours. Not the steady glow of gas lamps, but faint, pulsing flashes. When asked, Edward explained it away as testing a new kind of lamp oil. No one questioned him. Lydia's piano teacher, Mrs. Dallimore, remembered that the girl had once refused to play a particular melody, saying, "It reminds me of the room that hums." When asked which room, Lydia only smiled and changed the subject. And in the week leading up to October 12th, several deliveries were recorded to the Ellison residence, not of ordinary goods, but of peculiar scientific instruments, metal frames, plates of polished glass, and a brass device described on an invoice as an optical condenser. No explanation was ever found for their purchase, nor were the items ever recovered. The day before the photographic session, a passing Coleman reported seeing the family gathered at the upstairs window just after dusk. He described their faces as solemn, almost reverent, watching the street as though waiting for something unseen. He said they remained there, unmoving, for nearly an hour. 3 days later, the entire family was gone. But in those final days of normalcy, everything about them, their manners, their schedules, their habits, had continued in perfect mechanical precision, as though they were following a script whose ending none of them could alter. Inspector James Dorr, the first official to examine the Ellison case, wrote in his report, "The household offers no motive, no debt, no discord. They appear in every measurable way beyond suspicion. It is as though they had been selected not for who they were, but for what they represented: stability. The stability of the Victorian age itself, faith in order, in progress, in the permanence of the family, would soon be shaken by the impossible nature of what happened next. Because when an ordinary family disappears, one looks for clues in the living world. But when every trace of their existence begins to vanish, from papers, from memories, even from the minds of those who once knew them, the search moves beyond crime. It becomes an inquiry into the nature of reality itself. Every mystery begins with a moment, and for the Ellison family, that moment was frozen in silver nitrate, trapped forever within a pane of glass. The photographer was Horace Blythe, a man both ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. Born in Nottingham in 1848, Blythe had studied the chemistry of light long before it became fashionable. He was known for his precision, his patience, and his peculiar philosophy. "A true photograph," he once wrote, "does not capture a likeness. It captures the interval between the seen and the unseen." His studio stood above a hatmaker's shop on Pelham Street, marked only by a small brass sign that read Blythe, Portraiture and Plates. Inside, the air smelled of varnish, lavender oil, and the sharp tang of developer chemicals. Glass negatives lined the walls like translucent ghosts. Each bore faces that stared back from the depths of time. Soldiers, widows, newlyweds, all frozen within the fragile shimmer of silver salts. October 12, 1891, began like any other day. The rain had stopped before dawn, leaving the air cool and damp. Blythe recorded in his logbook, 10 a.m. the Ellison family. 5 subjects. Good natural light. Conditions stable. At precisely 10 o'clock, the family arrived, punctual to the minute, as expected. Witnesses later said they appeared dressed for eternity. Edward wore a black frock coat, freshly brushed. Marianne's gown, a dark bottle green silk trimmed in lace, seemed to drink the light around it. The children stood silently, their eyes alert, their faces pale. Blythe's assistant, a nervous young man named Henry Clark, prepared the camera, a large mahogany box with a polished brass lens and a sliding glass plate. Exposure times in those days were long. The subjects had to remain perfectly still, their faces calm, their hearts steady. Any tremor, any flicker of movement, could blur the boundary between life and light. But the Ellisons did not move. Henry later testified that they stood as still as wax figures, breathing so shallowly he could not tell if they breathed at all. Blythe, ever the perfectionist, adjusted the backdrop, a painted scene of an English garden, and placed a small mirror at the edge of the set to reflect more light onto the children's faces. That mirror would become the center of every theory that followed. When he finally removed the lens cap, the camera's shutter opened with a soft click, a sound that would echo in his mind for decades. 50 seconds of stillness. 50 seconds in which the Ellisons gazed into the lens, their eyes unblinking, their expressions calm yet strangely distant. Blythe would later describe the sensation in his private notes. "It felt as though they were not looking at me, nor at the camera, but through it into something beyond. I became aware of a low vibration in the air, like the hum of a tuning fork, though no sound was heard." When the exposure ended, Blythe covered the lens, released his breath, and thanked the family. They smiled faintly, nodded, and left. No laughter, no idle chatter. Blythe watched them step into the gray light of the street, and, curiously, the fog seemed to swallow them faster than it should have. That night he developed the plate. The process was delicate. Silver nitrate, collodion, and developer poured in darkness, the image slowly emerging under the soft glow of a red lamp. As the photograph formed, Blythe leaned closer, expecting the familiar shapes of faces and clothing. But something was wrong. The clarity of the image exceeded the limits of his camera's optics. Every hair, every thread, every pore was rendered with impossible sharpness. The shadows seemed alive, not black but deep. And behind the family, faint yet distinct, was the reflection of that mirror. Only now it showed more than it should have. Within the reflection stood a sixth figure. At first glance, it seemed merely a distortion, a smudge caused by chemical reaction or dust. But when Blythe examined it under magnification, he saw the faint outline of a person. Tall, unidentifiable, facing directly toward the camera. And unlike the others, this figure's eyes seemed alight. Blythe attempted to dismiss it as coincidence, yet the sensation lingered. He checked his darkroom for double exposures, recleaned his lens, and inspected the mirror itself. Nothing unusual. No tricks of light, no mechanical fault. The negative was pure. Still, he felt uneasy. He made a notation in the margin of his logbook. Anomalous reflection, possibly a result of refracted background light. But beneath that line, written faintly in pencil, was another note that he never shared. The reflection moved. That night, Horace Blythe dreamed of the Ellisons standing in his studio again. Silent, perfectly still, the light around them pulsing softly as though they stood beneath invisible waves. He awoke before dawn, certain of only one thing. The photograph he had taken was not simply an image of 5 people. It was a recording of a moment that did not belong to this world. When Horace Blythe first examined the Ellison photograph, he believed what he saw was simply the trick of a tired mind. After all, photography in 1891 was still half science, half sorcery. Light had to be tamed by glass and silver. Time itself was coaxed into standing still for a moment before returning to its natural flow. But this photograph, the Ellison portrait, refused to behave. In the weeks following October 12th, Blythe attempted to refine the image. He made 3 prints from the original glass plate, each developed under controlled conditions. Yet each time, small differences emerged. In the first print, everything seemed ordinary. Edward seated, Marion standing beside him, the children arranged neatly around them. The mirror behind the family shimmered faintly, a harmless decorative effect, or so he thought. In the second print, taken 2 days later, something had shifted. Lydia's expression, once placid, appeared altered. Her mouth parted slightly, her gaze no longer fixed upon the camera, but downward, as though she were listening. Samuel's hand, too, had changed position. Where before it rested on his lap, now it seemed raised slightly, palm open. By the third print, the distortion was undeniable. The background had darkened. The mirror's surface, once faint, now glowed with a thin halo of light. And within it, the mysterious figure, the 6th presence, had become clearer. Still blurred, but unmistakably human. Blythe wrote in his private notes, dated October 20th, 1891, "The image appears to shift each time it is exposed to light. Shadows are not constant. Faces drift subtly. The process behaves as though the plate itself remembers, and forgets with each printing." He repeated the process under lamplight, under sunlight, even under moonlight. Each time, something new emerged. A gloved hand where none had been before, a faint outline of movement in the curtain, a glimmer of light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. And yet, the strangest detail of all was the sound. On 3 occasions, while the photograph rested in his drying frame, Blythe heard what he described as a low hum, faint but persistent, emanating from the plate itself. It lasted only seconds, then stopped, like a distant chord struck and quickly dampened. He began to suspect chemical contamination. Perhaps the plate had absorbed mercury vapors or been exposed to static charge. But no such contamination explained the progressive alterations. When the Ellisons failed to collect their portrait by the end of October, Blythe decided to deliver it personally. He wrapped the photograph carefully and walked to Hawthorne Lane. The house was quiet, too quiet. He knocked 3 times, no answer. The curtains were drawn. The front gate, slightly ajar, creaked in the wind. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and lavender, as though the house had been closed for months, not days. On the kitchen table sat a teacup, half full, its surface filmed over. The clock on the mantel had stopped at 10:05. Upstairs, beds were neatly made, clothing folded in drawers. There was no sign of flight. No packed trunks, no missing valuables, not even footprints in the thin dust near the doorway. Only one thing caught his attention: a calendar pinned to the wall. The date still read October 12th, the day the photograph was taken. No other days had been marked. He returned to his studio shaken, clutching the photograph as though it might vanish, too. That night, unable to sleep, Blythe placed the glass plate under his magnifying lens once more. What he saw defied explanation. The figure in the mirror, that blurred, spectral shape, now stood closer. It appeared to have stepped slightly forward, its outline more distinct, its face faintly illuminated. And behind the family, subtle distortions rippled through the air, small waves of shadow and light, like heat rising from stone. He turned away, blinking. When he looked again, the effect had vanished. The following morning, he took the plate to a colleague, Professor Lionel Gresham, a physicist known for his work on optical interference. Gresham, intrigued, performed a spectral analysis using a primitive photometer. The readings revealed something unprecedented. Portions of the plate emitted a faint electromagnetic resonance, frequencies invisible to the human eye. "This is not reflection," Gresham said quietly. "It's transmission. Something is still being sent from within the image." When Blythe asked what that meant, the professor hesitated. "It means," he said at last, "that your photograph may not be finished developing." For days afterward, Blythe kept the glass plate covered in cloth, afraid to look at it again. But curiosity, or perhaps obsession, overcame fear. Late one evening, he uncovered it and held it toward the lamplight. The image had changed once more. The Ellisons' faces seemed fainter now, their edges less defined, as though dissolving into the background. Only the reflection in the mirror remained sharp, luminous, and disturbingly alive. Horace Blythe dropped the plate in terror. Struck the floor but did not break. Instead, it rang like struck crystal. That was when he realized something dreadful. Whatever the photograph had captured, it was not the Ellisons. It was what had taken them. By November of 1891, the Ellison disappearance had become more than a local curiosity. It had become an embarrassment. A respectable family of 5 vanished without reason or trace from a well-traveled street in Nottingham. The police could not ignore it, yet every investigation led only to silence. Constable Frederick Latham, a man known for his methodical nature, was assigned to lead the inquiry. His early notes are calm, professional, and full of confidence. "A simple case of voluntary departure," he wrote, "likely debt or private scandal." But as the days unfolded, Latham's tone changed. The deeper he looked, the less reality cooperated. His first step was to establish a timeline, when the family had last been seen. The answers contradicted one another. Mrs. Langford, the next-door neighbor, swore she had seen Edward Ellison on the evening of October 14th, locking his front gate. The grocer across the lane claimed the entire family had visited his shop after that date, on the 16th, to purchase sugar and tea. Yet a third witness, the local postman, insisted the house had already been empty by then, the windows dark, the mail piling up. It was as if the week of October 12th existed in overlapping layers, each witness describing a different version of time. Latham next turned to the Civil Registry Office, seeking documentation, birth records, property deeds, tax forms. What he found defied logic. The Ellison name appeared in the Nottingham census from 1881 through 1890, but the 1891 record, which should have contained their most recent entry, had been struck through with a faint diagonal line. The clerk responsible for the ledger swore he had no recollection of altering it. The ink was different, darker than the surrounding text, as though added later by an unseen hand. Worse still, the property deed for 14 Hawthorne Lane bore another name entirely. Mr. and Mrs. Caleb Dyer, dated 1886, 5 years before the Ellisons supposedly moved in. Yet there was no record of the Dyers ever living there, and no forwarding address. The legal paper seemed to have rewritten itself, erasing the Ellisons completely from ownership. When Latham visited St. Luke's Parish, the vicar produced the church's donation records. Where once Mrs. Marion Ellison had been listed weekly for alms and charity work, there were now empty spaces, literally blank, as though the ink had vanished. Even under chemical reagent, nothing appeared. The vicar's trembling statement read, "I remember her handwriting. I remember her smile. But I can no longer picture her face." The same pattern emerged everywhere. Lydia's piano instructor could no longer locate her attendance book. Samuel's schoolmaster claimed he had never taught a boy by that name. Yet, when pressed, admitted he owned a drawing of a small clock signed with the initials C. It was as if the Ellisons' presence was being systematically erased not only from paper, but from memory itself. By December, the case files were full of contradictions. Each interview only deepened the fog surrounding the family's existence. Inspector Latham's frustration boiled over in his personal log. There are moments when I question my own recollection of them. I visited their home, I know I did, yet even the street feels altered now. The numbering on the gates appears changed. The air there is colder, as though the place rejects remembrance. He ordered a full background investigation, tracing bank accounts and correspondence. Yet the Ellisons' financial ledgers, once active, were gone from the Midland Bank archives. The manager explained that an archival error had resulted in several missing pages, all coincidentally, from the year 1891. Even the local newspaper archives offered little. The Nottingham Herald had printed a short notice about the family's disappearance, but when Latham returned weeks later to retrieve the issue, the story had vanished from the bound volume. The space it should have occupied was blank, as if the ink had been lifted from the page. Faced with growing ridicule from his superiors, Latham turned once more to Horace Blythe, hoping the photographer's testimony might restore order to the confusion. Blythe presented him with the original plate, the glass still unbroken but faintly luminous at the edges. When Latham examined it, he recoiled. The family in the photograph appeared faded. Their eyes, once bright, were cloudy. The outlines of their faces seemed softer than before, as though the image itself were disintegrating. "What trickery is this?" Latham demanded. "No trickery," Blythe answered quietly. "Only truth." The constable's report that evening was brief, detached, and unsettling. The photograph deteriorates despite preservation. I suspect exposure to chemical vapors. The man Blythe shows signs of delusion. But later, long after the case was closed, archivists would find a final, handwritten note appended to the back of Latham's report. It was unsigned and written in the same fading ink that haunted every other Ellison document. The records are not lost. They are being rewritten from the inside out. And if this continues, none of us will remember they ever existed. Within a year, the Ellison case was officially declared unresolved and closed. No bodies, no crime, no explanation. And yet, every few years since, clerks at the Nottingham archives report an anomaly. A faint, recurring name appearing and vanishing in the registry logs. The name is always the same, Ellison, written, erased, and written again, as though history itself refuses to let them go. After Inspector Latham's inquiry had gone cold, the world moved on. But Horace Blythe could not. In the quiet months that followed, the photographer's life became an echo chamber of unanswered questions. He stopped taking commissions. His studio, once filled with families eager for portraits, stood dark except for the faint crimson glow that seeped through the cracks of his laboratory door. Blythe began to study the Ellison plate obsessively. At first, he treated it as a technical puzzle. Perhaps the chemicals had reacted strangely, or the exposure time had altered the silver nitrate crystals. But every test only deepened the mystery. The image changed. On some nights, the glass plate appeared perfectly normal. Edward and Marian Ellison seated, the children standing between them, still and dignified. Yet under lamplight, faint distortions began to appear. A movement of the hand here, a shift of the eyes there, as though each exposure revealed a slightly different truth of the same moment. "It is not a defect," Blythe wrote in his journal. "It is variation, an oscillation between possibilities." He began making contact prints in series, each one developed under identical conditions. No two were ever the same. In one copy, little Samuel seemed to smile faintly, though his expression had been solemn before. In another, Marianne's brooch changed shape, from an oval cameo to something crystalline, almost luminous. In yet another print, the family appeared fainter, as though receding into mist. Blythe documented each variation with the precision of a scientist. He measured temperatures, chemical ratios, humidity, even barometric pressure. When nothing explained the phenomenon, he began experimenting with light frequencies. He filtered daylight through stained glass and candle flame, through layers of blue silk and copper plates. One night, at precisely 1:07 a.m., during a thunderstorm, he recorded a result that shattered his skepticism. While examining the negative under a brief flash of lightning, he saw, just for an instant, movement. The father's head tilted slightly toward the camera. The mother's lips parted. He dropped the plate. It struck the table and splintered at one corner, but the image survived, and now the change was permanent. The faint tilt remained visible under magnification. "They respond," Blythe noted. "Not to me, but to light, to time itself." His experiments grew more elaborate. He built a rotating frame of mirrors, an improvised device meant to expose the photograph to shifting light angles. When he viewed the resulting print, the background of the Ellison portrait had altered. The studio wall, once plainly draped in fabric, now showed what appeared to be a door. Blythe was certain that no such door had existed in his workspace. He examined the studio repeatedly, tracing the wall with his hands. The plaster was solid. No seams, no hinges. Yet on the photograph, the outline was unmistakable. A wooden door, slightly ajar, and within it, the suggestion of a faint radiance. He repeated the process with different chemicals: silver chloride, collodion, mercury vapor. Each mixture produced variations, and each variation showed the door opening wider. By February of 1892, Blythe's notes had taken on an unsteady tone. "The door is not in the studio," he wrote. "It is in the image, a threshold captured by accident, a passage between frames of existence." He began sleeping less, working through the nights, speaking aloud to the photograph as though addressing an audience beyond sight. Neighbors reported hearing his voice from the basement. Calm at first, then agitated, sometimes pleading. He stopped eating properly. His assistant, a young apprentice named Thomas Gray, left after finding him one morning in the darkroom, staring at a newly developed plate. The boy swore that the figures in the image were moving, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, like a long breath trapped between two instants. Blythe dismissed the boy, locked the studio, and continued alone. One entry from his later notebooks remains particularly chilling. "I exposed the original plate to reflected moonlight for 3 hours. The image now emits a faint luminescence of its own. It no longer depends on external light. I have witnessed this glow without aid of flame or electricity. It is alive." He sent letters to several physicists at Cambridge, describing what he had observed, but none replied. A single response came weeks later, and signed, written in elegant handwriting. "Cease your work, Mr. Blythe. You are not developing photographs, you are developing intersections." That word haunted him. Intersections. He began mapping the variations, drawing overlays of each print. When layered together, the shifting shapes formed what looked like ripples. Not random, but patterned, as though the photograph was recording vibrations of another dimension, intersecting with our own. On the night of March 3, 1892, Blythe attempted his most daring experiment. He set up the camera again, in the same spot where the Ellison portrait had been taken. No subjects, only the empty room, the same angle, the same lighting. He exposed the plate for 45 seconds, heart pounding. When he developed it, the result froze him in place. There, faint, translucent, and unmistakable, stood the Ellison family, precisely as they had posed months before. He fell to his knees. "They are not gone," he whispered. "They are simply elsewhere." Blythe sealed the glass plate in a wooden case, labeling it Temporal Proof, Experiment 13. That was the last confirmed entry in his journal. A week later, the studio was found abandoned. The chemicals still simmered in their trays. The air smelled of ozone and silver. And on the work table, one final note: light remembers everything. And sometimes, it remembers too much. Spring of 1892 arrived in Nottingham without warmth. The Blythe studio remained sealed, the windows draped in dust, its silence unbroken. The townsfolk whispered of madness, of ghostly lights flickering behind the shutters, of a faint hum that could sometimes be heard at night, like the low resonance of a distant tuning fork. Inspector Latham, weary from his earlier failures, had long closed the Ellison file. Yet fate, or something stranger, refused to let the case rest. On the morning of April 12, 1892, the Nottingham post office received a small, unmarked envelope addressed simply to the officer who seeks the lost. The handwriting was delicate, deliberate, unlike any the clerk had seen before. There was no stamp, no seal, no indication of origin. And yet the ink was fresh. The envelope found its way to Latham's desk by accident, or so it seemed. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, faintly luminous under lamplight. The letter read, "Do not mourn us." The door opened wider than expected. "The air is clear here, brighter, as though sunlight carries thought. Tell Horace the light bends well in this place. We are together, and time feels kinder. M.E." The initials matched Marian Ellison. At first, Latham dismissed it as a cruel prank. But the ink, it was not ink at all. Under magnification, it shimmered, a metallic sheen unlike any pigment known to Victorian chemists. When exposed to candlelight, the script almost pulsed, as if alive. He locked the letter in his desk drawer. The next morning it was gone. In its place lay another envelope. The officer must not doubt. The man of pictures has crossed. He sought us through reflection and found passage. We see him sometimes, faint and pale, as if behind glass. It was signed S.E. Samuel Ellison, the youngest child. Latham's rational mind began to fracture. He questioned the clerks, the postal workers, even his own staff. None admitted to delivering the letters. Yet every few days another would appear, sometimes on his desk, sometimes tucked into the pocket of his overcoat, once even emerging from between the pages of his own notebook. Each missive carried more detail. "Mother says you still look for us. You need not. We are beyond losing now. The city is different here, built of shadow and glow. The river moves slower. No sound of bells. Father's trade continues. He sells spices that never spoil. The air carries scent through thought." The most unsettling came weeks later, in late May. "Do not let them take the glass. The image is the bridge. Once broken, both sides fade. The door must remain pictured." Latham brought the remaining letters to a chemist at the University of Nottingham. The analysis yielded no results. The material composing the paper was not cellulose, nor any known pulp. When heated, it did not burn. It simply disappeared, leaving no ash. Word spread quietly through the academic circles. Some speculated forgery, others dismissed it as the ramblings of grief. But a few, the ones who had read about Blythe's experiments, suspected something else. A breach, a correspondence across a boundary not yet understood. Then came the final letter. It was found not by Latham, but by a janitor cleaning the abandoned studio. It lay inside a shallow metal tray once used for developing photographs. The water had long since evaporated, yet the paper remained pristine, dry, and cold to the touch. It read, "Horace watches still. The door widens. We are learning to look back. Soon you will see as we see, the layers of every moment stacked like panes of glass. Do not fear when the light bends. It is only the world remembering itself." E. Edward Ellison's signature. Latham retrieved the note himself, his hands trembling. He placed it beside the others, intending to forward the entire collection to the Royal Society for study. But that night, during a sudden thunderstorm, his flat caught fire. The blaze was brief but devastating. His desk, his records, and the letters were all consumed. Only the metal tray survived, scorched black, but still faintly humming, as if resonating with an inaudible frequency. In the aftermath, no one could explain how the fire started. Witnesses claimed to have seen a flash of blue light, like a photographer's lamp exploding, before the flames began. Months later, a single fragment of paper was recovered from the ruins of the inspector's home. His text was partial, blurred by heat. "Light remembers. Time listens. The door will open again when memory aligns. It was unsigned. After that, no further letters appeared. Yet, in 1904, more than a decade later, an archivist in London cataloging unclaimed correspondence at the General Post Office discovered a sealed envelope with no date, no return address. Only a wax seal depicting a spiral of light. Inside was a photograph. The Ellison family, serene as ever, seated just as before. But behind them, where once had been the simple drapery of Blythe's studio, there now stood a vast horizon, luminous and endless, stretching far beyond what any lens of 1891 could have captured. On the reverse, in faded script, was written, "Tell them we are still waiting for the rest to see. Time has a way of softening impossibilities. What once terrified becomes folklore. What once defied explanation becomes curiosity." So it was with the Ellison case. By the turn of the century, few still spoke of the vanished family or the photographer who followed them into myth. Their story had become a whisper among collectors, an oddity footnoted in obscure journals of psychic phenomena and experimental optics. Yet history, like light, sometimes bends back on itself. In 1909, a young scholar from King's College, Dr. Edwin Carswell, stumbled upon a reference in an estate auction catalog, Lot 47 miscellaneous photographic glass plates, believed 19th century, property of the late Horace Blythe. Intrigued, Carswell purchased the lot for a few shillings, unaware that one plate would upend his career. Most of the glass negatives were ordinary portraits. Stiff-faced merchants, grim matrons, children in lace collars. But one stood apart. The emulsion shimmered faintly even under dim gaslight. When held to the window, the figures of a family appeared, faint, poised, impossibly serene. The seller claimed the plate had come from a sealed trunk found in a studio on Hawthorne Lane. Carswell recognized the name immediately. The Ellison disappearance had been one of Nottingham's most persistent urban legends, a family that had supposedly stepped out of existence. At first, he assumed the plate was a hoax, perhaps a double exposure or a chemical aberration. But under magnification, he noticed the same peculiar qualities noted in earlier reports. Edges that shimmered, light reflections that shifted subtly with the angle of view. He brought the negative to his laboratory. There, under the new electric lamps of the modern age, he made the first high-resolution print. The result left him speechless. The Ellisons were not static. Their eyes held a glint that seemed aware. The fabric of their clothing displayed impossible depth. Threads visible at microscopic scale, yet refracting light like glass fibers. And behind them, faint but unmistakable, stretched a landscape unknown to any earthly place. A pale horizon, marked by structures resembling spires or crystal formations. Carswell presented his findings to the Royal Photographic Society, but his peers mocked him. They accused him of manipulating the plate with mercury vapor or employing trick lenses. One critic sneered that he had been hypnotized by a ghost story. Undeterred, Carswell persisted. He subjected the plate to spectroscopy, measuring the reflected wavelengths. The data was bizarre. The plate emitted light frequencies outside the visible range, faint traces of ultraviolet and near-infrared, far beyond any chemical process of its era. He noted in his papers, the image retains active photonic memory, as if it continues to record, long after exposure. It behaves not as a photograph, but as a window frozen in flux. Shortly thereafter, the glass plate vanished. The Royal Society claimed Carswell had withdrawn it for further testing, but his personal effects, found years later in his abandoned flat, told a darker story. His notes grew erratic. I saw them move again. A flicker, the boy lifted his hand. When I blinked, the horizon behind them expanded, brighter than before. There is a resonance in the image, a hum felt through bone. Not sound, but something deeper, a memory vibrating beneath perception. By 1911, Carswell had disappeared. His last letter, addressed to a colleague, contained a single photograph. An empty chair before a camera, and behind it, the faint outline of a man dissolving into light. Decades passed. The Ellison plate became legend once more, part of the growing folklore of lost time phenomena. Occultists called it the door glass. Scientists dismissed it as fabrication. But every few decades, the story resurfaced, in whispers, in private collections, in grainy reproductions that never quite matched the original. Then, in 1972, during renovations at King's College, archivists uncovered a sealed crate labeled Blythe Experiments. Inside were notebooks, fragments of glass, and a small lead container wrapped in oilcloth. Within the container lay a photograph, faded but intact. Digital scanning revealed details unseen for nearly a century. The Ellison family appeared exactly as before, but with one crucial difference. In the foreground, half obscured by the frame, stood a sixth figure. A man. Tall, thin, wearing the dark coat of a 19th-century photographer. His face was indistinct, but his hand, gloved and reaching toward the lens, bore a silver ring engraved with the initials HB. The reappearance of Horace Blythe. The image caused a brief sensation among historians and physicists alike. Some dismissed it as forgery. Others whispered of temporal echoes. But when the photo was placed under polarized light, the reflection shifted once more, showing 7 figures, not 6. One of them, positioned at the far edge, appeared modern. A faint outline of a man in a suit, holding what looked uncannily like a camera from the 20th century. The archives sealed the image. Official reports were buried under optical interference anomalies. Yet those few who had seen it agreed on one impossible detail. In the bottom corner, etched faintly into the glass, were words no Victorian hand could have written. "We are still developing."